Hello and welcome. My name is Daniel Duke, and this is my review for A Resistance, a 2019 Korean film directed by Min-ho Cho and starring Ko Ah-sung. It received moderate reviews and made $7.8 million in box office when it released. So, as I said, it was directed by Min-ho Cho, who had taken about a decade off before releasing this film. He had released three other feature-length films in 2009, 2006, and then 2002, all of which received ratings between 5.2 and 6, so nothing particularly stand out. I do think that A Resistance is by far his best film to date. And as I said, it's starring Ko Ah-sung as Yu Gwan-sun. So to talk briefly about Ko Ah-sung's filmography, she's been an actress in Korean film and media in general since about 2005 and very active since 2015 onward. A lot of the work that she's done has been very well received, with many of these films and TV shows receiving between a 7 and an 8 on IMDb. So she's just overall been a very popular and successful actress in Korean media. Before we get into the film itself, I do need to give some background and history in case you don't know anything about the setting. So, in the late 1800s, Japan started to build its military and imperial efforts. You may know about this due to the Japanese occupation of China, maybe leading up to World War II, or its occupation of some of the Southeast Asian islands like the Philippines. So Korea also found itself in the crosshairs of this effort, and in 1910 it was formally annexed and became part of the Japanese Empire. Due to this occupation, there were massive efforts and protests, resistance movements nationwide. This ranged from peaceful demonstrations all the way to fully militant, violent resistance groups. In the case of this film, we're going to look specifically at the peaceful demonstrators, and kind of the biggest one of this was on March 1st. There was a giant protest that started in Seoul and then spread throughout the country over the next few months. These protests resulted in tens of thousands of arrests, thousands of protesters killed by the Japanese military police, and the abuse and imprisonment of some 45,000 Korean citizens. One of which was our main character, Yu Gwan-sun. She is a real life person. So who was Yu Gwan-sun? She was a Korean resistance activist who was arrested as a result on the demonstration on March 1st, 1919, at the age of 16 years old. During this protest in her hometown, which was completely peaceful, 19 people were killed, including both of her parents. These 19 people were fired upon by the Japanese military police, as happened in many of the other protests around the country at the same time. And after these 19 people were killed, Yu Gwan-sun was arrested and she was tried and found guilty by a Japanese-led court and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Normally, this imprisonment would have only been 1 or 2 years, but this was due to her particular outspoken nature and her criticism of the courts during her trial. She continued to hold pro-Korean values during her time in prison, and 1 year after the original March 1st Seoul protests, she led a large demonstration from within the prison. As a result of this, she was tortured and ended up succumbing to her injuries in solitary confinement. And before we move on to the film itself, I'd like to read one particularly powerful quote of hers. So, quote, "Even if my fingernails are torn out, my nose and ears ripped apart, and my legs and arms crushed, this physical pain does not compare to the pain of losing my nation. My only remorse is not being able to do more than dedicating my life to my country." End quote. After her death, she was viewed as a martyr for the movement and is looked at as a beacon of the Korean independence movement. Shrine exists in her honor today. There are many statues and shrines across Korea, and the one you see on the right side of the screen is one that has been very recently put up in Seoul in her honor. Now moving on to my review of the film itself. I thought this film was very well done. It sets out to show the hardships and mistreatments that Koreans faced under Japanese occupation, and I believe it succeeds in that. From Gwon-sun witnessing her parents' murder to her own eventual death at the end of the film, it's a riveting account of the struggles and hardship Koreans experienced, especially if they dared to resist or fight back from Japanese rule. As I mentioned earlier when discussing the true history of this time, Koreans faced extremely harsh treatment by Japanese occupants. There were countless atrocities, tens of thousands fell to Japanese forces if they dared to speak up, resist, or in some cases simply be at the wrong place at the wrong time. This film really finds its stride once Gwon-sun is sentenced and finds herself in a prison cell with many other women. She initially gets confronted by another woman for leading a revolt in her hometown, but quickly is welcomed in with the rest of the women. One thing that really stood out to me was how the women, due to being so crammed into the cell, had to slowly walk in circles to keep their legs healthy. This was due to how overcrowded it was, preventing more than just a few women at a time from laying down. So while maybe 25 women slowly circled the cell, a few at a time would get to rest in the middle. During this, even early on in the film, we see Gwansun's spirit. She led a song during their pacing and showed resistance to the guards as he tried to silence them. This stood out to me since she was so young and so new to this situation, but still faced it without fear. This trend continues throughout the film. She led she leads a chant on the anniversary of the March 1st protests from within the prison, which is so loud and powerful that not only does it overtake the women's wing, but also the men's wing and even spreads into the town surrounding the prison. For this, she's brutally tortured, beaten, and put into a tiny cell to prevent her from being able to move her legs. This still does not stop her, though. Eventually, most of the other prisoners are let out after the Japanese emperor reduces their sentence, but Guan-sun has to stay longer due to her 5-year sentence being twice the length of most of the other prisoners. During this extended time, she lays alone in an isolation chamber, refuses to eat, and slowly succumbs to the injuries she suffered at the hands of the prison guards. Speaking specifically about this film as a work of art, I thought the director did an amazing job. In particular, I thought the choice to shoot the entire time Guan-sun was in the prison in black and white was very interesting and an effective choice, only lifting once she was free of her captivity through her death. The choice, in fact, was so effective that I had forgotten that earlier parts of the film were in color. I think this serves to show how the past, the better times, can easily be forgotten when struggling through hardships. I also thought the composer did an amazing job. The use of music to set the mood was expertly done, both in the musical choices and the times that they chose not to have a soundtrack present. This, in combination with the black and white, led to a film with great suspense, solitude, and a pain that we shared with the main character. So, on to my conclusion. Overall, I think this film was very well done and represents a very important time in Korean history faithfully. Oftentimes, these kinds of dramatized historical films can forget their original story and take too much of creative license, but that's certainly not the case here. I think the film was very impactful and powerful, and this is due to many factors, including its use of black and white, the musical composition, as well as the acting and overall directing. I also wouldn't be able to talk about this film without mentioning Ko Asang's performance. She does an amazing job portraying Yu Guan-sun, and her expressiveness and emotions shown throughout the film are done extremely well. Finally, I think this film does a great job showing the truth of this time period. Japan unfortunately does not like to admit or talk about its abusive, imperialistic past, so films like this that show how cruel it truly was back in the 1800s and early 1900s are extremely important as a way to spread the knowledge through the generations and ensure that both Korea and Japanese histories aren't forgotten. I hope that anyone who sees this review and is interested in Korean history or really any history involving military occupation will give this film a shot. It doesn't hold back, shows the true gritty truth of the story, and will certainly leave you with both the knowledge and emotional impact that this time period had on Koreans.